بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين أما بعد. So yesterday we covered the letter Tha, and inshallah today we'll be moving on to the letter Jeem. So today's topics are going to be: number one is how is the letter Jeem pronounced? Number two is how is Jeem pronounced when it's mutaharrik, when it has a haraka, and when it's sakin. And number three is Jeem has a khalqala, and how do you do a Jeem's khalqala when it's sakin and when it has a shadda? So first, let's go through how Jeem is pronounced. This is very straightforward. So Jeem is pronounced by making contact between two parts. Number one is the middle of the tongue. Now it's up to you if you want to call it the middle of the tongue or like the area between the front and the middle, like whatever the 1/4 in the front, whatever you want to call it, that area of the tongue, that comes into contact with the front or middle portion of your upper palate. So if we feel the top of our mouth from where our teeth begin on top, you'll see there's a hard part, and right behind it, it starts getting soft. So the Jeem, when you pronounce it Jeem, the middle or front portion of your tongue, it's hitting that area to make that Jeem sound. Jeem, Jeem. So that's where it's hitting to create the sound of a Jeem. Jeem is relatively easy for people because a Jeem is found in practically every language. One thing is that before the letter Jeem actually comes out, the tongue actually blocks all of the air from leaving. We learned before about something called shidda, and that's happening here as well. Before you say the Jeem, the air actually fills up. Jeem. So you can't just pronounce the Jeem without letting that air actually first gather up and then go. So there shouldn't be any area left on the top, otherwise a Jeem will not come out. If you leave an area on top, it will be more like a Jeem, which will obviously be incorrect. But no one really does that, so it's not much of an issue. So now let's move on to the next thing. How do you do a Jeem that has a haraka? So the Jeem with the harak is very easy. When Jeem has a haraka, very simple. That tongue is on the upper palate. Just release it from that area and make the motion for the haraka. And we discussed the motions for the fatha, dhamma, kasra in previous classes. For example, if Jeem has a fatha, like the word jahannam, so it would be ja, ja, ja. So you have that tongue on top palate, and then when you give the fatha, you separate your jaws. Ja, jahannamu. There is a dhamma, then your lips will have to come together after you release the tongue. Ju, ju, ju. So jumi'a. Next is if there's a kasra. That's when you have to put the lower jaw a bit down. Jibal, jibal. So you release the tongue and then you make the motion for the kasra. Jibal, jibal. So that's that. There's an error here. It's okay. Ignore the line at the bottom. We'll get to it later, inshallah. Next thing is when Jeem is sakin. This is where it gets slightly more complicated, but we covered a part of this when we were talking about Aba. When a Jeem is sakin, the tongue is going to be released from the upper palate. So your tongue is touching the upper palate when you're saying a Jeem, right? Ja, ju, ji. But when a Jeem is sakin, you release the tongue, but then don't make any motion for a fatha, dhamma, or a kasra. None of those motions should be there. You're simply, when a Jeem is sakin, your tongue touches the upper palate and then it releases, and that's about it. Nothing else should be happening with your mouth or your jaws or anything. This will create the sound of what we talked about before, a qalqala, which is kind, as they say, like an echo, even though it's not really an echo, but it makes the sound of qalqala. For example, here you have the word yaj'alu, yaj. So j. So you're basically it's like you're tapping the top part of your mouth and then just letting it go, but you're not doing anything else. Yaj'alu, yaj'alu, or yaj'al. Next, if there's a dhamma before it, same thing. Yakhruj, ruj. So you're simply just tapping the top part and then just letting it go. Nothing else is happening with the mouth. Yakhruj. Next is if there's a kasra before it, ijlan. So ij. So all of them are the same. J. All of them have the exact same sound. J. There should be no ju, ji, ja happening. That would be incorrect. So that is when the Jeem is sakin, and it is the second letter that we've discussed now. That's a letter of qalqala. Here's another example of a Jeem that will have qalqala because it's ending off at an ayah. Zojim bahij. Bahij. So you're stopping at the Jeem because of the ayah. Bahij. So it's as if the Jeem would be sakin here because it's stopping at an ayah. Bahij. Bahij. So it shouldn't be bahiji, ju, ja, bahij. J, j. So the ones on top and the ones on the bottom are exactly the same in terms of how they sound. You're just simply tapping your tongue on top and then letting it go. Just j, j, j. Doesn't matter which one it is. At a higher tajweed level, they say that qalqala letters that come in the middle of an ayah, they're called the lesser qalqalas, called qalqala sughra, and the ones that come at the end of an ayah are called qalqala kubra. We won't go into the details of that. There's not really a difference between the two. The only difference is one is more obvious and the other isn't. Otherwise, they sound exactly the same. Last thing is, there will be no qalqala if the Jeem has a shadda. If it has a tajdeed on it, then you are not going to do any qalqala. For example, in the first ayah, min kulli fajjin amiq. You will not do qalqala on that Jeem because there's a shadda on it. Fajjin. You will not say fajjin. That would be wrong. It says fajjin. So if it has a shadda, there is no qalqala. Min kulli fajjin amiq. Like in the next example, hasibatu lujjatan. Lujjatan. You will not say lujjatan. That would be wrong. There will be no qalqala if there is a shadda. And then right at the end, I mentioned unless you stop on it. Unless you stop on it. And I'm going to get to this in the next slide, inshallah, and then we'll end up. So the last thing I wanted to discuss was doing qalqala on a Jeem when it is the last letter of the word. This gets a bit complicated when you're stopping. So, inshallah, I'll discuss this in a bit more detail for another letter where this happens a lot more, but let's just go through this. So if a word ends with a Jeem or any letter of qalqala, this qaf, ta, ba, Jeem, dal. So if a word ends with a Jeem and that Jeem has a shadda as well, and that Jeem has a tajdeed on it as well, and you're stopping on it, then there will be qalqala because you stopped on it. When you stop on any word, it makes it into a sakin. So for example, over here we have wala jidala fil hajj. There will be a qalqala, hajj, hajj. So you won't say fil hajj. That would be wrong. And some people, when they see an example like this, they get a bit confused. So I thought I would explain it in a bit more detail. A shadda, whenever we see a shadda or a tajdeed, it means that there's two things there. That means there's actually two letters. The first letter is sakin, and the other letter has a haraka. For example, in this word, in the word fil hajj, what's actually happening is there's a two Jeem. The first Jeem is sakin, and after that, there's another Jeem with a kasra. That's actually what's happening. So now the question is, which one has the qalqala? Because there's two Jeems, right? Which one is going to have the qalqala? We're probably thinking, oh, the first one because it's sakin. No, that's incorrect. The qalqala here will be pronounced on the second Jeem, not the first. So when you say this word fil hajj, to do the qalqala, you're going to do this qalqala on the second Jeem because you're stopping. Fil hajj, fil hajj, fil hajj. That's how the qalqala is going to happen. Fil hajj. So the first one is hajj and then j. So you're doing qalqala on the second one. We already did the letter ba. In, for example, Surah Tabbat or Surah Lahab, whatever you want to call it, it happens there on the first ayah too. Tabbat yada bi lahabiyun wa tabb, wa tabb, wa tabb. Just make sure that there no one does tabba or tabbu or tabbi, then you're making a haraka. So wa tabb. Same thing here, fil hajj, fil hajj. All you're doing is you're basically just releasing your tongue or releasing your lips. Do not do anything else. So fil hajj, then just release it. Fil hajj. And tabbat yada abi lahabin wa tabb. Wa tabb. This is obviously when you are stopping. If you are not stopping, then there's going to be no qalqal. Then it's going to be fil hajji. Right? Fil hajji and whatever is after that. Or tabbat yada abi lahabin wa tabba ma aghna. Then there will be no qalqala. There are a few mistakes that people make in this situation. Inshallah, when we get to the letter qaf, I'll explain mistakes that are made in this situation because off comes a lot more as the last letter when you're stopping, especially in the word haq, as opposed to a jeem. Jeem, very rarely you find where there's a shadda and you're stopping on it. But this is one situation in the second juz. وَلَا جِدَالَ فِي الْحَجِّ. So we'll stop here for